Well, good morning, Hill Country. It's so good to see you in person. Thanks so much for joining us. If you're online, welcome. It's so good to have you as well. And if you've been around here the last couple of weeks, you know that we are right in the middle of a series right now called Move to Normal, where we've been looking at James, the half-brother of Jesus and the early church leader, as he writes to this first century church who's experiencing all kinds of adversity as well as uncertainty. And as we've been walking with them through this challenge and even this letter that James has written to them, this thing that we're seeing that just keeps coming up over and over is just how difficult life can be. I mean, when you live in the middle of adversity and uncertainty, it's challenging. And that was true for the first century church, but it's also true for many of us here today. There are some of you that as you're tuning in here this morning or you're just kind of leaning into it, there's this reality that uncertainty and adversity create a powerful context for difficulty. And some of you are just feeling it this morning. That's where it's at for you. And, you know, as we jump back into what James is going to have to say to us, there's this reality that life, you know, sometimes it doesn't always just get better. It's not just that you wake up and all of a sudden it's all good. But the reality is that it's hard. And some of you are going through hardships right now. And as you think about going through the book of James, there may be some of you that are like, I don't really know if I even want to listen to James this morning. I'm going to just kind of tune out. And if that's you, like, I get it. But I just want to encourage you with something that as you think about James, you know, James is going to speak to the heart. He's going to speak with raw authenticity this morning. And if you've ever known anything about James, one of the things that you see about him over and over again is that he doesn't really like to talk surface level. He doesn't really beat around the bush. Like, he gets right to the heart of things. And this morning is going to be no different than that. I mean, he's the kind of guy. I mean, if you've ever met someone like that doesn't always have a filter, but like they just kind of speak what's on their mind. I feel like James is like that sometimes. Or it's kind of like this. You meet someone for the first or second time. And you say, like, man, isn't today just beautiful outside? It's incredible. The weather's incredible. And they look at you and say, yeah, it's beautiful. What's your view on global warming? Like, it's kind of like one of those things where you're kind of like, whoa, just calm down. Like, we're just having a conversation. But they go right to the heart of it. Like, they like to get down into the meat. And maybe you're a person like that, or you're used to being around a person like that. I don't know if James is just like that, but he's pretty good at getting to the heart of the matter. And I think one of the reasons he's so good at getting to the heart is because he understands the urgency of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He understands the impact that the gospel has, not just for eternity, but the impact that the gospel has for the here and now, the today, that really matters. And so James sees what he's saying to this first century church, and he comes with this raw authenticity because he knows that the gospel has the power to transform your life, and he doesn't want anybody to miss it. And so as we dig and as we lean in this morning, I want you to know that James is going to invite you to take a serious look inside your soul. And sometimes when you take a serious look inside your soul, it's not always the most comfortable place to live in. But I want to invite you to do it. And whether you're a follower of Jesus or someone who's still just trying to figure out what you believe or what you think about Jesus, I want to invite you to take this look inside your soul. I want to invite you to listen to what James has to say and to evaluate what he has to say. And as we do this morning, I want you to know he's going to ask a question, and it's one of those kinds of questions that messes with you a little bit. It forces you to think. It forces you to ponder. It forces you to question. And as you ask this question, it's one of those questions that can be so humbling when you take the time to investigate it and answer it. So with that in mind, I want to invite you to turn with me over to James chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 1, and we're going to look at this question that's going to cause us to get underneath the hood this morning. It's going to cause us to evaluate. So here it is. James chapter 4, starting in verse 1, here's this question. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Now pause there for a moment. Have you ever taken the time to ask a question like that? Have you ever paused long enough to actually think like, well, what is it? What is it that causes quarrels? What is it that causes fights among me, in my circle of influence, in my family, and in my friends? And you know, what I love about James here is he doesn't really just ask the question of, are there quarrels and fights among you? He assumes that. And the reason James assumes that is because he's well acquainted with the human condition. And you know this too. You don't have to look very far to actually see where conflict resides, right? You don't have to look very far to see where your last fight was, to see where your last quarrel was. And maybe some of you don't even have to look beyond what's already taken place this morning. You know, because for you this morning, there's already been a list of unmet expectations. There's already been a list of lack of communication. And so therefore it's created a lack of clarity. And so for you, maybe it's in your marriage, maybe it's in your family, in your house, there's already been some conflict stewing. And if I'm putting salt in a fresh wound, I apologize. But you got to think about this because it's inevitable. Like we all experience conflict at some level. And if you would just think back, just think back over your last week, think back over your last month. Where's conflict been? Where have fights and quarrels been? Maybe it's something that's happened not only in your marriage, but in your house, but then even beyond that, maybe at work. Maybe you left a situation on Friday that you're still stewing over. You're still playing that conversation over in your mind, and it's bothering you. And you know that tomorrow you're about ready to walk back into it, and you're going to have to deal with it. And even right now as I talk about it, there's an anxiousness building up in you, and I apologize for that, but you know it's there. You know it's waiting on you. You know that the conflict that resides all around you actually impacts what's deep inside of you. Now remember what James is doing here with this question. He's not asking if you have this kind of conflict. He's assuming that you already do, and he's inviting you to dig deeper and to actually ask the question, why? Why do you have that conflict? Why are you fighting? Why are you quarreling? What's going on in your marriage, in your house, at your workplace? Like, why? Don't just say what it is, but ask the question why. Get underneath the surface a little bit. And as we ask that question, James is actually going to provide a diagnosis because we don't just look at the why. We got to understand what's going on at the root level. And here's what James has to say. He says, is it not this, that your passions, or another way that word can be translated is pleasure. Is it not this, that your passions, your pleasures are at war within you? Now, I've got to be honest. I do not like James's diagnosis here. Because whenever I think about conflict, whenever I think about fights and quarrels, you know what I like to do? I'm sure you're not like this, but you know what I like to do? Is I like to look out there. And I like to think that the conflict or the problem or the fighting, that it's actually a problem out there, that it's because of something that they've said, they've wanted, they've desired, they've done. But did you hear what James just asked or what he said? Isn't it because of the passions that are at war within? The problem isn't out there, but actually the problem that James is saying is the reason, the why behind what's actually taking place is actually not out there, but it's actually something that's going on in here. And I don't like that because I don't like to believe that it's a problem with me. But like I said, James, he doesn't really like to mince words much. He likes to get right to the heart of the issue. And when it comes to conflict, I don't know if you're like this, but I like to explain it away. I like to come up with an excuse. I like to believe that it's got to be something else other than what I've thought, what I've said, what I've done, how I've acted out. And he illustrates this for us. Look what he says in verse 2. He says, you desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. Now let's be honest. There are desires inside of you. There are passions. There are pleasures that reside within you, and you want them when you want them, and in what way and how you want them. Like that's what happens inside of you. You have those desires. It's part of how you've been created, and it rages war on your soul. And if that is the operational mode of who you are, longing for those things, you know this conflict is inevitable, isn't it? It's inevitable when those are your desires, fighting and warring, those passions inside of you. This past week in our household, we got a new trampoline in our backyard. And I know my kids like to jump on it, but we probably got it because I really like to jump on trampolines. This is my third one putting together, and it's by like a pure miracle of God that that's actually taking place. But it's in our backyard, and something crazy happens whenever we put a trampoline up in our yard. I don't know if this has ever happened in your house, but in our house, the kids, as soon as it's done, they all go running towards it, and there's this competition to see. Actually, let me say that again. There is name calling, there's fighting, there's bickering, there's, well, I don't know if there's punching, but there's at least name calling going on to see who's going to be the first person to get to jump on the trampoline. And when that happens, as a father, I'm like, guys, calm down. Like, you're all going to get to jump on it. You're all going to get to take a turn. Just let someone else go first. It's really not that big of a deal. And when I see that, as a father, you know, you pray that they would mature beyond that they'd grow up a little bit. But then do you know what happens? Right after we have that time jumping, we're all hungry, so we drive to Chick-fil-A. And whenever you get to Chick-fil-A, you know there's at least 5 laps around Chick-fil-A of cars. And you're like, oh, come on. And you know what I do is I see that line, and there's another car coming at the same time that I'm coming. And I push on that gas as fast as I can to try and get in front of that other car because I'm stinking hungry. Now, why do I do that? I mean, real mature, right? Why do I do that? Because I have desires. I have passions. There are things that war inside of me, and there are things that war inside of you. And those passions, those desires that may be true of a 5-year-old, you know what? They're also true of a 65-year-old. They just look a little bit different. And they come out in sometimes the exact same way with fits of rage, impatience, anger, wanting to put yourself first, wanting positions of power, recognition. And it happened. No, why? And James is saying, why do we do this? But he's getting to the heart of the issue. And look at what James says. In the end of verse 2, he says, you do not have because you don't ask. You ask and you don't receive because, here it is, you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now, when I read this passage, I kind of get this mental image of a counselor sitting down with a couple whose marriage is struggling. When I read this passage, I get a mental image of a friend sitting across the table from another friend who's entrenched in conflict. And here's what I hear them say. After reading this passage, they're looking them straight in the eye and they say, I've got something I need to tell you. And it's meant to help you, not hurt you, but it's going to be hard. And they say, the problem that you're experiencing right now in conflict has less to do with what's going on in that other person. And the problem you're experiencing right now in conflict actually has to do with a problem that you have with God. You see, the problem that you have right now is because you have a wrong perspective of God. Because anytime you choose your will, the way you want it, in the time and manner that you want it, when you look at God and say, you know what, I want to do things my way, and you know what, God, if you don't mind just stepping to the side, or maybe you haven't even talked to him at all, it's more of just a, you know what, I'm going to get what I want when I want it. You are actually, what James says here, is an enemy of God. You're putting yourself in opposition. There's this enemy that creates because you are going after your passions to spend it wrongly on yourself. Now, I got to ask you a hard question. Did I just describe you in any way? When you think back over this last week, have you been warring? Have you been battling for your will, your way, when you want it, how you want it, and what way you want it? Have you been fighting for position? Have you been fighting for power? Have you been fighting for recognition? Have you been fighting with a defensiveness so that people will see you a certain way? You see, God has created you with desires, with passions. But he who is the God of love created you to find your to find your full joy and your full pleasure in him. And do you know what happens? When our hearts go after things other than God, when our hearts go after pleasure that isn't God at all, we end up in a place where we're settling for something that is so far less than what God has. Because that's kind of what sin does, isn't it? Sin has this desire, it has this appeal that says, you know what, this is going to be good, you're going to enjoy this, just go for it. It's really not that big of a deal, and no one else is really going to know. It's not going to really impact other people. And sin always does this. It overpromises, but then it underdelivers. Sin always does this. Sin offers these short-term gratifications, and they're good in the moment, but then do you know what comes with it? It carries with it long-term disastrous consequences. And some of you right now, you are experiencing the fruit of sin. Because there was a decision that you made in your life that you thought it was good in the moment, but it carried with it long-term disastrous consequences, and you are experiencing that right now. You know the pain of this. And do you know what we end up doing? Is we actually start to treat God and other people like Amazon Prime. We look at him or we look at others and we say, I want my pleasure, I want my passions, and if you can't get it to me in 2 days or less, then forget you. You get annoyed, you get irritated, you get angry. And when we have this view of God that's skewed, we are trying to spend on our own passions, on our own desires, or we look at someone else, and if they can't fill us, or that thing, whatever that thing is, can't fill us the way that we thought it should, we end up having a problem with God. And we have to hear this today. And I say this as someone who's preaching this, like I have to hear this today. When my heart isn't consumed with the love of God, conflict is inevitable. Because we will try to find in this created world the things, the people of this created world to fill us in a way that only God can fill us. And this war that's raging on the grounds of your soul will only continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to spill out onto other people. So let me ask you a question. What war is being fought on the grounds of your heart this morning? What is it? Or let me ask it another way. What desire other than God is fighting for your heart? Do you think about that for a moment? What desire other than God is fighting for your heart, and how is that desire creating conflict? And here's what I want you to do is I want you to think about that conflict in your life. Whether it's in your marriage, at work, you name it, wherever it is, you know where it is. Maybe those around you know where it is, but you know where it is. And remember that conflict, how it's so easy to see like out there somewhere? That conflict, could you just think about, would you feel the emotion of it for a moment? And here's what I want you to do with whatever that conflict is, whatever that arguing is, whatever that quarreling, whatever that fighting, and would you begin to trace it back? Because remember, what's out there is actually, if you trace it back, something that's going on in here. There's a war going on inside of you, and it manifests itself externally, but really there's something going on internally. So what is it? And I don't know what you're thinking about right now. I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know what burden is upon you. I don't know what you're overwhelmed with. And maybe as you think about this, quite frankly, you're sick and tired of the fight. You are sick and tired of the battle. You are exhausted and you're tired because you know it's there and you don't know what to do with it. And if that's you, could you please listen to what James says next? Could you please listen to it? Look at it. The scripture says, he yearns jealously over the Spirit that he has made to dwell in us. Verse 6, but he gives more grace. Now I have that underlined. He gives more grace. more and more and more and more grace. What James is trying to do is to turn your attention to Jesus. Because in the middle of the battle, in the middle of the war, in the middle of the struggle, he wants you to know that Jesus loves you so much. He loves you with a love that is so pure and so faithful. He pursues you with his love that will never give up on you no matter how many times you give up on him. He's jealous for you, meaning he is pursuing you with a passionate grace and a passionate love that is a grace upon grace, which is a grace upon grace. James wants you to know that you are not in this battle by yourself, and while you may feel lonely and tired, you are not alone. Because Jesus is battling on your behalf, and his grace is more powerful than what is ever going on inside of your heart right now. In fact, his grace, it is so big and so powerful that he is actually in that grace inviting you to come out of hiding. You don't have to wear the mask anymore. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to fake it. You don't have to do the charade. Because his grace is that big and that powerful that no matter what that dark, deep thing is in your life, his grace is so big and it's been covered on the cross. And so whatever it is that you're trying to push down, bury, and hide, Jesus says grace upon grace and even more grace. Now, I don't know about you, but I want that grace. No, I need that grace. How about you? So how do we get to a place of receiving that kind of grace? Because I don't want that kind of grace to be head knowledge and out on the periphery. Like, I need it to change me, transform me, do everything it can with me in my life. Because I don't have it all together. Well, how do we receive it? Look at what James says next. He says, therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but here it comes, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Did you see it? Did you see what happens? Did you see how we receive grace? Did you see what what James said? That God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So here's the move. There's a move that we need to make. If we want to be receivers of this kind of extravagant grace, there's a move that we make toward humility. And we do that by moving away from pride. Because God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Now, humble here can be translated with the word lowly, less than. Do you remember in John chapter 3, where John the Baptist, he's out in the wilderness and he's baptizing all these people, and there's people coming from all over the place to see John. Even Jesus comes out to him. And then after Jesus is baptized and begins his ministry, all the people begin to go towards Jesus. Do you remember the scene in John 3 where one of John's disciples comes to him and he says, John, like, what's up? Why is everyone going after Jesus? Like, we had all the crowds, we had all the attention, everyone was coming to us, but now they're going to Jesus. Why are they doing that? Do you remember John's response in verse 30 of chapter 3? Here's what John says. It says this about Jesus. Jesus, he must increase, but I must decrease. Now, that's a statement of humility. Because humility is lowly. Humility decreases so that Jesus can increase. So a humble person, someone who walks in this kind of humility by walking away from pride, is a person who trusts God rather than themselves. This kind of humility is a person who trusts God to help them resist the devil. They're not trying to do this on their own. They're not trying to manufacture it, muscle up, and make it happen. They're saying, God, I can't do this unless you show up and show off in my life, because I can't. A humble person is a person who trusts God to help them draw near to God because they realize they can't do it on their own. They need God's grace and power in their lives so that they would draw near to God. A humble person is a person who trusts deeply in God to show them who they really are and who he really is. Because a humble person lives in dependence. They're needy. for the grace of God in their lives. So are you moving towards this kind of humility? Like, is this who you are? Does this describe you? Are you a person who's becoming less, becoming lowly, so that Jesus is increasing in your life? Is that you? Or is it possible that pride's been getting in the way? You see, when James says God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, are you a person of pride? Now, I don't know too many people who wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm pretty much a proud person today. It doesn't normally come like that. Pride is one of those things that has a tendency to slither into your life and you don't even realize it. Because pride, like any other sin, is tricky, because that's what the enemy, Satan, does. He's crafty, he's tricky. He makes something that is meant for good and he twists it in order to be deceptive. And so I've got to ask the question, have you allowed pride to slip into your life in any kind of way? And if so, how would you know it? How would you see it? What would it actually look like? Well, I think James is going to help us diagnose that as well. Look down at verse 11. It says, "Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge." You see, the fruit of pride is a critical, judgmental heart. Because what pride does is not only does pride have a conflict that happens within, pride does something else. Pride creates a conflict with others. It creates conflict with others. Do you have a critical heart? Have you examined your internal conversations recently? Do you ever find yourself viewing others and having an internal conversation that's full of criticism, it's full of judgment? It actually hopes that they would trip up, mess up, fall over. Now, I know you may have not ever shared that with anyone, but it's actually happening inside, and you can kind of spot it, you know it, you've seen it, you've experienced it before. Do you quickly pick up on other people's weaknesses and failures? Now, maybe you've kept that to yourself and it's rooted in your heart, but maybe you've gone a step further. Maybe you've not shared that with that other person, but you have some other people in your life that you felt comfortable enough to share that with. And maybe you've even done it in the form of a prayer request, where you've said, you know what, this person, they annoy me and they're bothering me and they've said this and they've done this, and oh, by the way, look at what they posted. And so rather than having a heart of care and love, desiring to build up rather than tear down, you've either had this internal conversation or you've had it with other, and the motive behind that conversation, again, whether internal or external, the motive was not to build up, but it was actually to tear down. The motive was actually to build yourself up while tearing someone else down. Have I just described you in any way over the last week, over the last month, over the last year? Is it possible that pride has slithered its way into your life and maybe you haven't even recognized it? When you think about your marriage, is it a place of love and appreciation for one another, or is it a place of criticism and judgment? When you think about your real life group, your small group, when you think about your circle of friends, is it a place of love and care and appreciation where there's a motive to build up? Or is it the opposite of that? You see, if pride or a critical spirit or if judgment is getting the better of you, James has something that he lovingly wants to say to you. Would you look at verse 12? Here's what he says. There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? Now, do you remember at the beginning when I said that James wasn't going to mince words? He wasn't going to play around, he was going to get to the heart of things? Well, I think James right here is making something crystal clear. There is a judge, and it's not you. I don't think he could say it any more clear than this. There's a judge, and there's a throne that he sits on, and it's not your throne. It wasn't meant for you, but it was meant for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so if you are practicing as judge, there's a different kind of internal conversation that you need to have. You know where I struggle with this? And maybe you do too. Sometimes when I'm scrolling through social media, I'll look at people's posts or comments, and I do this internal conversation where I become a great lawyer, and I can justify why I'm right and they're wrong. I make accusations based off of what they've posted. I actually assume motive when I've never even had a conversation, or I haven't even seen that person in years. Do you ever do that? I know I do that. And that's something that God is working on me with, because I can easily ascend to his throne, and often he has to ask me to step aside. You know, I want you to know that if that's you in any way this morning, I don't believe for a second that it's an accident that you're here today. I don't think it's by accident. Because God in his grace and in his mercy wants to point that out to us. You know why? Because he's powerful enough to forgive it. You know, you don't want to go to the end of your life and look back and see a person who's had a critical, judgmental spirit. Do you know why? Because if that's you looking back on your life, it'll mean this, that you are a bitter person. If that's how you live the years of your life, it means that you will have had a cold and bitter heart, looking at other people, pointing the finger at them as to why they were so messed up and not right, rather than having an honest evaluation of yourself and seeing the power and the grace and the mercy and forgiveness of God in your life. So if that's you this morning, I want you to know that the power and the chains that you've been living in of a critical and judgmental spirit can be broken by the power of God's grace. And do you know how that happens? It happens when you're willing to admit it honestly and come to him who sits on the throne and say, I'm sorry. Can you please forgive me? Do you need to do that today? Do you need to ask the God of grace to forgive you of a critical, judgmental spirit? I want you to know that if that's you, he is ready and he is willing to forgive you. He is pursuing you with his love, and that's why you're here today, because he wants to heal you completely from that kind of heart. So will you ask him? Aren't you tired of it? You have an opportunity to do that today. Well, James doesn't stop right there. He's going to continue to move on because there's this conflict. Remember how it started in chapter 4, verse 1? He says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? And so far we've seen that there's this conflict that happens within. There's a conflict that happens with other people, but even beyond that, there's this conflict with God that we're all experiencing. And what James is going to expose in the last part of chapter 4 is there's a conflict with God that exposes its ugly head on a daily basis with how we think about our future. Look at what he says in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you don't know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. When I was a kid, both of my parents worked full time, and I went to a daycare. And the daycare that I went to was this sweet lady. She was actually my Sunday school teacher for a number of years. And one day I went to her and I said to her name was Esther. And I said, Esther, you know what I've been trying to tell my mom? Is that I'm the boss. And she doesn't get it yet. Well, at least that's what my mom tells me I told her. I don't know if it's true, but that's what she says. You ever have a kid like that? You have a kid who thinks they're in charge, thinks they're in control. They're like the king and queen of the universe. They're these little self-sovereigns. They think they're sovereign over their little domain and maybe even your household or even what you're going to have for dinner. They're sovereign over those things. Are you a person that's like that ever? Where you're sovereign, or at least you think you are, over your own little universe, your own destiny, and maybe for you, you have your 5, 10, and 15-year-old plans all figured out. You know how life is going to go because you've calculated it, you've measured it, you've put it in a spreadsheet, and you know what it's going to look like. Let me ask a harder question. Do you struggle with this belief of autonomy? Thinking that you are the ruler and that when you're not in control, something's wrong with life? Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with strategic planning. There's absolutely nothing wrong with goal setting. There's nothing wrong with intentional movement. But do you know what happens when that becomes the center of our universe rather than God? We actually put ourselves on the throne again rather than allowing Him to sit on the throne. When our strategic planning and our goal setting become the center, when it becomes the core of who we are, we actually ask God to step aside so that we can step into His place. And I don't know if you've learned this yet about your life, but you actually weren't designed to be God, and neither am I. And God knows that, and often He has to graciously say, could you please step aside because I'm God and you're not? Would you allow me to be sovereign over you? But so often we try and take it back, we steal it back, we fight for it, we bicker, we complain when things don't go the way that we want it, and really nothing has changed since the garden, right? Remember what happened in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve? Do you remember the lie that they believed? When the serpent came to them, they said, if you eat this fruit, you can be like God. You can actually have His position, knowing His thoughts. You don't have to live dependently anymore. You don't have to live submissively anymore. You can live at the center of your world. And that lie has brought brokenness into our world, and it's all around, and you can see it every day. But beyond the brokenness in our world, do you know where that brokenness has found itself? It's found itself into your heart. Because when we believe the lie that we're in control, when we believe that we're sovereign, it is the core of the brokenness that manifests itself out into our daily lives and the decisions that we make, the way that we treat other people, the way that we plan, the way that we view our finances, the way that we view relationships. Because we're not. We're not in control. We're not God. We're not self-sovereigns. Do you pride yourself in your strategy and your organizational ability? If that's you, James has a warning. Here's his warning in verse 16. He says this, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Solomon, the wisest man of all time, says this in Proverbs. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. No wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. Do these verses make you a little bit nervous? Do they make you a little bit anxious? Because there's a way in which you'd like your world to go, and you're not sure that the sovereign Lord is going to deliver the way that you want it, in the time that you want it, and how you want it? Is it possible that the conflict in your life is actually there, not because of what someone else has done or said, but that conflict is there because you have set yourself up to be God in His place? And today He's showing you that He's God, that He's sovereign, that you make plans, but ultimately He directs your steps, that He's a good, gracious God who's been pursuing you with His passionate love, who knows what's best for you even when it's hard. Is it possible that the root of all of your conflict is because you've been trying to grab hold of your self-sovereignty? And maybe today what God is asking is that you would move to humility by actually moving away from self-sovereignty. You see, Jesus showed us what humility looked like. And we need that humility. We need that humility to save us. We need that humility to rescue us, because humility says, God, I can't save myself. I know I've tried. I know I've done whatever I could, but I can't do it. Jesus, I need what you did on the cross to rescue me and save me. And for many of you, you've trusted in Jesus to do that. You've trusted Him to save you for eternity. But do you know what? That humility doesn't stop right there. It continues on for the rest of our lives, so that on a daily basis we say, Jesus, I need you to love my spouse. I can't do it. Jesus, I need you. to live out your will into this world. Jesus, I need you to help me with my finances. Jesus, I need you. You see, humility is where real life is able to grow. But pride, and when you live in the middle of pride, it actually lives in opposition to God. And God is inviting you to move into this place of humility today. So are you willing to do it? Are you willing to make that move? Are you willing to move away from pride? Are you willing to move away from judgment and a critical heart? Are you willing to move away from self-sovereignty? And are you willing to move towards humility? Because when you move towards humility, you move towards Jesus, who, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. You see, in humility, God moved towards us through his Son, Jesus Christ. And today we have an opportunity to move in humility by the power of Jesus Christ. And so today, are we ready to trust him to become less and less and less so that he can increase and get bigger and bigger and bigger in your life? What move do you need to make today? Would you pray with me? Father, we come to you right now asking for your help. God, this move of humility, you showed us what it looked like in your Son, Jesus. And so we have the most perfect example. We have the most perfect model ever. But God, we can't do this on our own. So God, would you come and help us? Would you help us to move away from pride? Would you help us to move away from a critical spirit and judgment? Would you help us to move away from being our own self-sovereign little kings and queens? And God, would you reign supreme in our life? Would you be the one that we worship? Father, would you increase and help us to decrease? And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.